In the quiet moments before the world begins its noise, the soul is already listening to something greater than itself. Many rise each morning speaking first to fear, worry, and unfinished burdens, yet wonder why their spirit grows weary before the day has truly begun. But there is another way, a holier rhythm in which the heart bows before heaven, before it bows before circumstance. When God speaks first, confusion loses its authority, and peace enters like sunlight through an opened window. A transformed day is not born from stronger effort alone, but from a soul that has learned to hear the eternal voice before the temporary voices of the world. There is a strange tragedy in the modern soul. A man awakens each morning already surrounded by voices before he has even discovered his own thoughts. The world rushes toward him with demands, alarms, opinions, anxieties, unfinished obligations, and invisible fears. Before his feet touch the ground, his mind has already entered a battlefield. He reaches first for the noise of the world, and only afterward wonders why his spirit feels restless all day long. This is not merely a habit, it is a slow surrender of the heart, for whatever speak. First in the morning often governs the atmosphere of the entire day. Many people do not realize that the soul is deeply impressionable in its earliest waking moments. Like soft earth receiving the first rain, the mind absorbs whatever falls upon it first. If fear arrives first, fear lingers. If chaos enters first, confusion spreads its roots quietly through every thought and decision. The world understands this more than most believers do. That is why the world competes so fiercely for attention at dawn. It wishes to define reality before God does. It wishes to tell a man who he is before heaven reminds him whose he is. The danger is not merely distraction, it is spiritual displacement. When the world's noise becomes the first authority of the morning, God is gradually moved from the center of life to the edges of it. A man may still claim faith, still speak of hope, still utter prayers in passing, yet his inner world is already being shaped by lesser voices. Anxiety begins to sound more convincing than promise. Urgency appears more powerful than wisdom. The temporary starts masquerading as eternal truth. There are souls who wake each day immediately consumed by news, by by social expectation, by the endless hunger to know what the world is saying. Yet the soul was never designed to carry the weight of every yet. Most people never notice how deeply the soul is shaped by whatever it hears first. The human spirit is like soil in the early morning. The first voice becomes the first seed. If anxiety enters first, fear begins to root itself before breakfast. If bitterness enters first, the heart carries invisible weight throughout the day. This is why the modern world fights so fiercely for a person's attention at dawn. Before the feet touch the floor, messages arrive. Before the eyes fully open, worries begin their march through the mind. The world does not wait quietly outside the door anymore, it rushes straight into the soul without permission. And many have mistaken constant noise for necessary living. But silence before God is not emptiness, it is preparation. It is the sacred stillness in which the scattered pieces of the heart begin to gather again. There is a silence that weakens a man because it is filled with loneliness, but there is another silence that strengthens him because it is filled with presence. The difference is eternal. 1L. Eve's the soul abandoned to itself, the other places the soul beneath the shelter of God's voice. Most people fear silence because they imagine they will find nothing there except their own restless thoughts. Yet often the reason their thoughts are restless is because they have never remained still long enough for heaven to speak above the storm within them. God rarely competes with the chaos men create. The divine voice is not usually found screaming above the noise of panic, ambition, distraction, and endless striving. Scripture again and again reveals the holy pattern. The whisper, the still small voice, the quiet call heard only by the listening heart. The tragedy is not that God refuses to speak. The tragedy is that mankind has filled every corner of life with so much sound that it no longer recognizes peace when it arrives. A soul addicted to noise eventually becomes uncomfortable with holiness because holiness often arrives quietly. And so the morning becomes sacred ground. Before the machinery of the day begins turning, before responsibilities pull at the mind, there exists a brief doorway where eternity may enter time. In those moments, silence is not wasted time, it is alignment. The weary heart slowly. And when that greater voice begins to govern the soul, something extraordinary happens within the hidden places of a person's life. The morning no longer begins with panic rushing through the veins like a storm breaking through thin walls. Instead, prayer enters before pressure does. And this single change, though invisible to the world, alters more than most people can understand. For what enters the heart first becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. Many people attempt to carry the weight of the day before they have first surrendered themselves to the one who carries worlds. They rise already rehearsing their fears, calculating their failures, anticipating rejection, conflict, disappointment, or lack. Even before a problem truly appears, the mind has already built an altar to anxiety. This is why so many souls feel exhausted by noon. They have been fighting spiritual battles with human strength alone. Yet prayer was never meant to be a religious decoration attached to life after everything else fails. Prayer is meant to be the breath before the burden. There is an unseen transformation that takes place when prayer comes before pressure. It does not always alter circumstances immediately, but it alters the person facing those circumstances. And often that is the greater miracle. For the world measures transformation by visible outcomes, while God often begins transformation in invisible places. A heart that enters prayer before entering pressure slowly becomes less controlled by emotion and more governed by truth. Fear may still knock at the door, but it no longer owns the house. The soul that prays first discovers that many anxieties lose their power once they are spoken aloud before God. Darkness thrives in hidden chambers of the mind, but prayer drags fear into divine light. What seemed unbearable in isolation often weakens in the presence of eternal perspective. A problem placed before God may remain difficult, but it no longer appears ultimate. The praying soul begins remembering that circumstances are temporary visitors, while God remains constant. There is also a profound difference between carrying burdens alone and carrying them consciously before heaven. One crushes the spirit, the other humbles it without destroying it. The human heart was never designed to function as its own savior. Yet modern earn life teaches people to depend endlessly upon themselves, their plans, their control, their understanding, their constant effort. And because mankind worships self-sufficiency, many secretly collapse beneath the pressure of maintaining the illusion that they are strong enough alone. Prayer interrupts this illusion. Prayer reminds the soul that weakness admitted before God becomes strength received from Him. This is why some people can endure storms that should have shattered them completely. Outwardly, they appear ordinary, yet inwardly they have learned the sacred habit of placing pressure beneath prayer, instead of placing prayer beneath pressure. One order leads to peace, the other leads to quiet destruction. The remarkable thing is that prayer often transforms the day long before the day fully unfolds. A man who has prayed before entering conflict speaks differently during conflict. A woman who has surrendered her fears before God walks into uncertainty differently than someone consumed by panic. Even decisions begin changing. Reactions soften. Discernment sharpens. Patience deepens. The transformation is subtle at first, almost hidden, but over time it becomes undeniable. Prayer changes not merely moments, but posture, the inward posture of the soul toward life itself. And yet many resist this holy rhythm because prayer feels slower than worry. Anxiety gives the illusion of control because it keeps the mind constantly moving. Prayer, however, requires surrender. It demands that a person stop striving long enough to admit that ultimate control belongs to God alone. This is deeply uncomfortable for the human ego. Men would often rather exhaust themselves through endless mental labor than kneel in dependence. Yet exhaustion never produces peace. Only surrender does. There are battles won in prayer that the world never sees. Temptations weakened before they could grow. Harsh words restrained before they escape the mouth. Despair interrupted before it consumed the heart. Directions revealed quietly before confusion could lead the soul astray. Heaven often works invisibly first, because the deepest transformations occur beneath the surface long before they appear outwardly. A tree does not become strong because of what is visible above the ground alone, but because of what deepens unseen below it. And so the person who learns to pray before pressure discovers a mystery the world cannot fully explain. Peace that arrives before circumstances improve, strength that appears before answers come, and confidence rooted not in perfect conditions, but in the steady awareness that God has already entered the day ahead of them. And once the soul begins living with that awareness, fear slowly loses the throne it once occupied. Not all at once, not in some dramatic moment where every uncertainty suddenly disappears, but gradually, like darkness retreating before the patient arrival of dawn. For fear survives by convincing the heart that it walks alone. Confusion grows strongest where there is no clear voice to guide the wandering mind. But when God's direction enters a person's life, even before circumstances change, something within begins to steady itself. Many people mistake confusion for complexity, when often confusion is simply the result of too many competing voices. The world speaks endlessly. One voice urges haste, another whispers despair, another promises fulfillment through ambition, another through pleasure, another through endless striving. The soul, pulled in every direction, eventually becomes exhausted, not because life itself is impossible, but because it has lost the simplicity of divine guidance. A compass surrounded by magnets cannot point north correctly. Likewise, a heart surrounded by endless worldly noise struggles to recognize truth. This is why God's direction is more than instruction, it is liberation. It removes the unbearable burden of trying to navigate existence alone. There is a deep weariness that settles upon people who believe every outcome depends entirely upon their own understanding. They analyze endlessly, worry endlessly, rehearse every possible disaster, fearing one wrong step may destroy everything. Such a life becomes imprisoned by overthinking. The mind circles the same fears repeatedly, hoping anxiety itself might somehow produce safety. Yet fear never grants wisdom. It only magnifies uncertainty until the soul begins trembling before shadows. But divine direction carries a different atmosphere. When God leads, the soul may still encounter difficulty, yet it no longer moves blindly through darkness. There is profound peace in knowing that one's life is not governed merely by accident, chance, or human limitation. Even unanswered questions become lighter when placed before the sovereignty of God. The believer begins realizing that clarity does not always mean seeing the entire road ahead. Often it simply means trusting the one who does. This truth stands against the modern obsession with total control. Human beings long to know every outcome before taking a step. They crave guarantees, certainty, visible proof that no pain or failure lies ahead. Yet faith has never operated through complete visibility. If every answer were already visible, trust would become unnecessary. God often gives light for the next step, not the next 100 steps. And this unsettles the human heart because pride prefers mastery while faith requires dependence. Still, there is remarkable freedom hidden inside surrender. The person guided by God no longer has to carry the crushing responsibility of pretending to be all-knowing. They can move forward without demanding absolute certainty, because their confidence rests not in their own perfection, but in divine wisdom. Fear weakens when the soul understands that God sees what human eyes cannot. Confusion fades when the heart stops worshipping its own limited understanding. There is also a subtle tyranny in fear that many fail to recognize. Fear does not merely warn, it governs. Left unchecked, it begins deciding which opportunities are pursued, which dreams are abandoned, which conversations never happen, which acts of obedience are postponed indefinitely. Fear turns potential into hesitation. It keeps souls standing outside doors God may already be calling them to enter. And because fear often disguises itself as caution or practicality, many never realize how thoroughly it has ruled them. But God's direction interrupts this tyranny. Divine guidance produces courage not because danger vanishes, but because purpose becomes greater than fear. A soul that knows God has spoken can endure uncertainty differently than a soul abandoned to its own doubts. Even suffering changes character when it is faced with divine assurance. Pain without meaning crushes people. Pain carried within purpose transforms them. This is why Scripture repeatedly joins peace with guidance. God does not merely command, he shepherds. The image is deeply important. A shepherd does not reveal the entire journey to the sheep at once. He leads step by step, protecting, correcting, directing, watching dangers unseen by those following behind him. The sheep's safety lies not in its own intelligence, but in staying near the shepherd's voice. Modern humanity resists this image because it wounds human pride. People wish to be self-sufficient architects of destiny. Yet the soul was created not for independent sovereignty, but for trusting relationship with God. And when a person finally begins seeking God's direction before seeking the world's approval, a holy calm begins settling over life. Decisions no longer arise entirely from panic. Delays no longer feel like immediate destruction. Closed doors no longer automatically mean abandonment. The heart becomes less frantic because it has stopped believing it must force every outcome into existence by sheer effort alone. God's direction teaches patience because it reminds the soul that divine timing is rarely hurried, yet never late. Even in difficult seasons, there remains an inward steadiness. Confusion may visit, but it no longer reigns permanently. Fear may whisper, but it no longer speaks with ultimate authority. Somewhere deeper than circumstance, the soul begins resting in the quiet certainty that the God who guides stars through endless galaxies is fully capable of guiding one human life through another ordinary day, yet the ordinary human heart struggles deeply with this kind of trust because impatience feels far more natural than surrender. People desire immediate answers, immediate change, immediate relief from uncertainty. They wish to plant seeds in the morning and gather harvests by evening. But God rarely works according to the hurried rhythms mankind creates for itself. Heaven moves with purpose, not panic. And every morning, whether people recognize it or not, a quiet battle begins between human impatience and divine timing. The human spirit resists waiting because waiting exposes how little control it truly possesses. A man can distract himself during the day with activity, ambition, noise, and endless motion. But morning has a way of revealing the deeper condition of the soul. In those first waking moments, the fears return quickly. Why has nothing changed yet? Why is the answer delayed? Why does the promise seem distant? Why does God remain silent while pressure keeps increasing? And because modern culture worships speed, delay is often interpreted as failure. But God does not measure time the way frightened humanity does. Panic because they see only fragments. God remains steady because he sees the whole. What appears delayed to human eyes may actually be preparation. What feels like divine silence may be unseen construction taking place beneath the surface. Yet impatience blinds the soul to this mystery. It demands fruit before roots are deep enough to sustain it. It asks for doors to open before character is ready to walk through them wisely. There is something deeply revealing about the morning struggle between impatience and trust. Before the day even unfolds, many people already begin wrestling against time itself. They wake rehearsing unfinished dreams, unanswered prayers, disappointments, financial pressures, relationship wounds, and private fears about the future. The mind immediately begins calculating how long things have remained unresolved. And slowly, without realizing it, people begin measuring God's faithfulness according to their preferred schedule. This is one of the oldest temptations of the human soul, believing that delayed answers mean abandoned prayers. Yet throughout Scripture, divine timing repeatedly confounds human expectation. Abraham waited. Joseph waited. David waited. Ed. Even those closest to God often endured long seasons where promises appeared painfully distant. The waiting itself became part of the transformation. For God is not merely interested in giving blessings, he is shaping souls capable of carrying them. Impatience, however, wants the gift without the process. It wishes to arrive without journeying. It wants resurrection without crucifixion, wisdom without suffering, maturity without endurance. But the soul formed too quickly often breaks just as quickly. There are lessons learned only through waiting, lessons impossible to acquire through comfort alone. Waiting exposes idols hidden within the heart. It reveals whether a person truly trusts God or merely trusts favorable outcomes. This is why mornings matter so deeply. Morning reveals what the heart truly expects from God. Does it approach him with trust or with quiet resentment that life has not unfolded according to personal timelines? Many people pray, but beneath their prayers lies an unspoken demand that God must act immediately in order to prove his goodness. Yet divine love is not measured by speed. A surgeon who operates carefully is not cruel because he refuses to rush. Likewise, God's timing may feel slow to anxious hearts, but slowness is not absence. There is also a profound danger in spiritual impatience because it often drives people ahead of God's direction. Some doors are forced open prematurely. Some relationships are pursued out of loneliness rather than wisdom. Some decisions are made not through faith, but through desperation to escape uncertainty quickly. Human impatience would rather move wrongly than remain still long enough to trust. Yet rushed decisions frequently create the very pain people hope to avoid. But the soul that learns to seek God first each morning slowly develops a different relationship with time itself. Instead of treating every delay as punishment, it begins asking what God may be building within the waiting. Instead of panicking over what has not yet happened, it begins noticing what is already being refined. The waiting heart becomes more observant, more humble, more aware that transformation often occurs invisibly long before circumstances outwardly change. This does not mean waiting becomes easy. Even faithful souls grow weary. Even believers struggle with questions in the night and heaviness in the morning. NG. But divine timing teaches endurance by drawing the heart away from frantic striving into deeper dependence upon God. And strangely, the more a person trusts God's timing, the less enslaved they become to constant anxiety about their own. For impatience narrows life into a prison of immediate outcomes, while trust widens the soul into eternal perspective. The impatient person believes everything depends upon arriving quickly. The trusting person slowly learns that God can accomplish more through surrendered waiting than human beings can accomplish through endless striving. And somewhere within the quiet tension between unanswered prayers and continuing faith, the soul begins discovering that God is not only working on circumstances ahead, but also on the person who waits before him each morning, and as that transformation deepens, the first moments of the morning begin carrying a weight far greater than most people realize. For the beginning of the day is rarely just a beginning, it is a direction. Whatever claims the soul first often shapes every choice that follows afterward. This is why surrendering the first moments of the day to God changes far more than a morning routine. It changes the posture from which a person lives. Most people move through life reacting rather than discerning. They wake hurried, pressured, mentally crowded before the day has truly started. Their decisions are then formed not from peace, but from emotional momentum. One irritation leads to another. One anxious thought opens the door to 10 more. By midday, the soul feels scattered, and by evening, many cannot even explain why they feel so exhausted. The day has controlled them instead of them walking through the day with inward steadiness. But surrender changes this pattern at its root. To surrender the first moments of the day to God is to place the soul back into proper order before the world attempts to disorder it again. It is the quiet acknowledgement that life was never meant to be governed merely by impulse, emotion, or circumstance. Before conversations begin, before decisions arise, before temptations appear, the heart bows first before heaven. And that early surrender leaves fingerprints upon everything afterward. A person who begins the morning with God often speaks differently throughout the day. Words that might once have erupted in anger become restrained by wisdom. Dom. Reactions that once flowed from pride begin softening into patience. This does not happen because the individual suddenly becomes naturally virtuous, but because surrender has interrupted the tyranny of self. The human ego prefers immediate reaction. It wants to defend itself quickly, satisfy itself quickly, justify itself quickly. Yet morning surrender teaches the soul to pause before acting. And in that pause, wisdom enters. The world encourages people to trust their feelings above all things, yet feelings are unstable rulers. A man may feel strong one hour and hopeless the next. He may feel certain in the morning and confused by nightfall. If decisions are governed entirely by shifting emotions, life becomes directionless. But surrendering the day to God establishes something deeper than emotion, it establishes alignment. The soul stops asking merely, "What do I want today?" and begins asking, "What does God desire to form within me today?" This changes even ordinary decisions in ways the world rarely notices. A surrendered morning affects how a person handles disappointment, temptation, delay, criticism, success, and uncertainty. The transformation is subtle at first. The person still faces difficulties. Pressure still comes. But something invisible has shifted within. Instead of instantly collapsing into frustration, the heart begins remembering the presence it encountered earlier. Instead of reacting entirely from wounded emotion, it recalls truth spoken in stillness before the noise began. There is also remarkable protection hidden inside daily surrender. Many destructive choices are not made because people lack intelligence, but because they lack inward stillness. Exhausted souls make impulsive decisions. Hurried minds overlook wisdom. Hearts disconnected from God often seek comfort in whatever promises immediate relief. But surrender slows the soul enough to recognize what truly matters. It creates space for discernment before action. This is why the enemy of the soul fights so fiercely against quiet mornings with God. Distraction is not always about entertainment alone, it is often about preventing alignment. If the soul can be rushed immediately into chaos, it becomes easier to manipulate through fear, anger, envy, insecurity, or temptation. A scattered heart is easier to control than a surrendered one. But when a person has already need, little before God in the morning, there exists within them a certain spiritual resistance against the confusion of the world. Even suffering changes under the influence of surrender. Painful moments no longer appear entirely meaningless because the soul has already entrusted the day into divine hands. The surrendered person still grieves, still struggles, still wrestles with uncertainty. But beneath all of it remains the quiet awareness that God has not lost control simply because circumstances became difficult. This awareness steadies decisions during moments when emotion alone would have led the heart astray. And perhaps this is one of the greatest miracles of surrender. It frees a person from living as a prisoner to every passing circumstance. The world remains unstable, people disappoint, plans fail, delays happen, unexpected sorrows arrive without warning. Yet the surrendered soul is not anchored primarily to circumstances anymore. It is anchored to God. And because of this, decisions gradually become less driven by fear and more guided by wisdom, less controlled by panic and more shaped by peace. Over time, this daily surrender forms a different kind of person altogether. Not perfect, not untouched by struggle, but inwardly governed by something stronger than impulse. Their life begins flowing not merely from reaction to the world, but from relationship with God. And long before others notice any outward change, heaven has already begun reshaping the hidden foundations from which every choice is made. And when those hidden foundations begin changing, the soul slowly discovers something the world spends entire lifetimes searching for yet rarely finds: true peace. Not the fragile peace that depends upon favorable circumstances, but the deeper peace that remains even while storms continue raging outside. For when God speaks first, and when the heart consistently places itself beneath His voice, wisdom and clarity begin flowing into life like light entering a darkened room. Many people move through existence spiritually disoriented because they have never learned how to listen beyond the noise of their own fears. Their minds remain crowded with endless contradiction. One moment they feel hopeful, the next defeated. One voice tells them to trust, another urges panic. And because the soul cannot serve two masters peacefully, inward confusion becomes its constant companion. This is why so many people appear outwardly functional while inwardly exhausted. They are attempting to navigate life without spiritual clarity. But clarity is not merely intellectual understanding. Divine clarity is the quiet ability to see life from heaven's perspective rather than from temporary emotion. It is possible to possess education, talent, ambition, and worldly success while remaining inwardly confused about purpose, direction, and identity. Yet when God's voice begins governing the heart, confusion slowly loses its power to dominate the mind. The soul starts recognizing what truly matters and what merely pretends to matter. This transformation often begins in very ordinary ways. The person who once woke consumed by dread now rises with a strange calmness that cannot fully be explained. Problems still exist, responsibilities still wait, uncertainty has not disappeared entirely, yet something within feels steadier. The soul no longer rushes immediately toward fear because it has learned where to turn first, and this habit of turning toward God before turning toward the world changes the atmosphere of life itself. Peace enters gradually, almost like dawn appearing over a dark horizon. At first the change feels subtle. Reactions soften. Thoughts become less frantic. The need to control everything weakens slightly. Then over time the difference becomes undeniable. Situations that once produced panic no longer possess the same authority over the heart. The soul still feels concern, but not complete collapse. It still faces battles, but not alone. There is an inward awareness that God has already gone ahead into the day. And where peace enters, wisdom often follows. Fear clouds judgment because frightened people rarely see clearly. Anxiety magnifies problems while shrinking perspective. A fearful mind tends to react impulsively, either grasping desperately for control or retreating entirely into hopelessness. But the soul that rests in God's presence begins discerning differently. It becomes less enslaved to appearances and more attentive to truth. Decisions are no longer made entirely through emotional pressure, but through spiritual clarity. This clarity is precious because the world constantly attempts to distort reality. Society teaches people to define themselves by achievement, approval, wealth, appearance, status, or public recognition. Yet these things shift constantly. Anyone who builds identity upon them eventually lives in fear of losing them. But when God speaks first, identity begins rooting itself somewhere eternal. The soul remembers that it is known by God before it is recognized by the world. And this realization changes how a person walks through life. Criticism loses some of its power. Success becomes less intoxicating. Failure no longer feels final. Even loneliness changes character because the heart no longer measures its worth solely by human attention. Spiritual clarity restores proper proportion to life. Temporary things stop pretending to be ultimate things. And once this perspective begins forming within a person, wisdom naturally follows because wisdom is not merely intelligence, it is seeing life truthfully. There is also a holy courage that grows inside the soul that consistently listens to God first. Such a person becomes harder for the world to manipulate through fear or distraction. They are not easily shaken by every opinion, trend, or crisis because their foundation no longer rests upon unstable ground. The world may still tremble around them, but inwardly they remain chord. This does not mean life suddenly becomes easy. Even the faithful encounter grief, disappointment, waiting, and seasons of silence. But the difference is profound. The soul guided by God no longer walks through those valleys without light. Divine peace becomes more than emotion, it becomes endurance. Divine wisdom becomes more than knowledge, it becomes direction. Divine clarity becomes more than understanding, it becomes the steady awareness that God is present even when circumstances remain unclear. And so the transformed day eventually becomes a transformed life. Not because every problem vanished, but because the soul itself has changed. The heart that once awakened in fear now rises in trust. The mind once ruled by confusion now rests beneath divine truth. The person who once sought answers first from the world now seeks first the voice of God. And in that sacred order, peace settles where anxiety once lived, wisdom grows where panic once ruled, and spiritual clarity shines quietly through every ordinary moment of the day.